Hello everyone, I'm Abhishek Naik, a PhD student at the University of Alberta, working with Professor Richard Sutton on reinforcement learning and artificial intelligence. How do we learn to predict and control the world around us in order to achieve goals? How do we perceive, learn, and act? I find this question extremely fascinating, and if you attend the Cognitive Neuroscience Seminar, you probably do too. These questions are remarkably hard and have been subjects of intense philosophical and scientific inquiry. They have spawned many diverse fields that study it one way or another: artificial intelligence, psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, ethology, etc. In this talk, I'll highlight how some of the existing connections between these fields have helped advance our understanding of the learning mechanisms in the brain. One of the goals of this talk is also to seed collaborations between these closely related fields to answer the ultimate question of how the mind works. And here's the general outline of the talk. I'll first give you some RL and psychology background and then introduce some of the connections between them. Then I'll give some background for neuroscience and then establish some connections between RL and neuroscience. Finally, having established some common language, I'll pose some open questions that could leverage ideas from these closely related fields. Alright, starting off with what's the key set of differences between supervised learning and reinforcement learning? So, supervised learning broadly consists of making a bunch of independent decisions. So, you have one decision after the other that you have to make, and all of these are independent. The order does not matter. And the feedback that you get is instructive, which means that for every decision that you make, you will get to know what the correct decision is, right? And this feedback is also mostly immediate, which means that as soon as you make a decision, you get this instructive feedback as to what the correct answer is. Now, to contrast this with reinforcement learning, that consists of making sequential decisions. So you may make one decision after the other, and every decision affects what you see next, and hence the decisions that you'll have to make next. And the feedback that you get is evaluative instead of instructive, which means you don't get to know what the correct decision or action was, you just get to see its result, which means whether it resulted in something good or bad. And this feedback can also be delayed, which means that if you had taken some action like 10 steps ago, you might see its some feedback based on that only a long time in the future. Right. And most real world tasks are sequential in nature. So, a simple example could be you're sitting at home in quarantine or self isolating, and you're thinking of, okay, what should I eat tonight? And now the decision is sequential in the sense that first I have to pick the cuisine, right? So let's say, should I take Italian, Thai? Maybe I'll decide I want to eat a burger today. Now, based on that decision, now I have to decide, should I order from a restaurant or from a fast food place? Let's say I think I want to get something from a fast food place. Now I have to make a decision between Harvey's, Fatburger, A&W. If I pick A&W, now I have to choose between a Papa Burger or a spicy habanero chicken burger. So you see how the decisions are inherently sequential in nature, right? And all of this can be abstracted away and can be seen in this very simple sort of formulation in which there's this agent who's interacting with the world. So the agent gets to see some observations of what could be the state of the world, and based on that, it takes some actions which affect the next observation that the agent will see. Right. So now, what is temporal difference learning? Broadly speaking, it's a method in which you update predictions to match later and more accurate predictions about the future before the final outcome is known. So mathematically, this would look like, if P is my prediction, my new prediction would be some old prediction, a factor of that. So alpha is a fraction between 0 and 1. So this is a combination of these two things. So some fraction of the old estimate plus some fraction of what the correct estimate is. Now, generally, we don't really know what the correct estimate is, so we can approximate it using just some hopefully better estimate, right? So we move a new prediction to a combination of what our old prediction was, and we want to go in the direction of what the better prediction is. Now, if I rearrange these terms, this looks like P old plus alpha times P better minus P old, right? And in TD learning, now we'll call this prediction the value of a state, right? So you are in some state of the world at some point of time, and you want to estimate how valuable that state is. So that's the prediction you're making. So you'll update your prediction. So your new prediction will be this old prediction plus alpha times new prediction, which is the reward plus the prediction of the state that you end up in and whatever your old prediction was. So you're moving your estimate towards a newer, hopefully more accurate estimate of the future, and you don't know what the outcome is at this point of time. So yeah, this can be thought of as learning a guess from a guess. And this term, this looks like an error, right? So this is what is called the TD error and is denoted by delta. So TD is temporal difference. Okay, so let's talk about some psychology concepts now. So this is a famous classical conditioning example, Pavlov's dog. What happens is when the dog sees food, it salivates, and that denotes the reward that the dog gets, right? So that is called an unconditional stimulus, that without any conditioning, the food makes the dog elicit some reaction, right? Now let's say we add a neutral stimulus, which is the ringing of a bell. So you condition the dog in the sense that you ring the bell every time you present the dog the food, and so after conditioning, it forms an association of the bell with the reward that it would get, which is the food. So every time you ring a bell, it would salivate, and so now you have conditioned this particular stimulus to elicit the response that it generally used to give for the unconditioned stimulus in prediction of the reward, in anticipation of the reward, right? So this is the unconditioned stimulus, and this is the conditioned stimulus, denoted by US and CS. So this is the simple classical conditioning experiment, and again, this can be abstracted away in terms of this diagram in which the CS is, so on the x-axis is time. So first the CS is presented for some time, and then the US is presented, which is basically the food. So the bell and then the food, and so basically the CS now predicts the US. Now one particular concept in classical conditioning is that of blocking. So what is blocking? So let's say you have some US, which is the reward, and some conditioned stimulus B, right, which occurs for some time before the reward. So after enough trials, you learn some association with it. So again, this is number of trials on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the strength of association of the stimulus. So as the number of trials progresses, you eventually learn to associate this particular cue or stimulus with the reward, which is the US. Now, let's say after this has been trained for a while, you introduced a new stimulus at the same time as the old one, right? And so what happens is the association between this new conditioned stimulus A and the reward is prevented or blocked because of this existing stimulus that reliably signals the delivery of the reward. So what ends up happening is that even after this CSA is already introduced, it does not learn any association with that new stimulus because it is already being reliably predicted by the other one. So this is the concept of blocking. Similar but slightly different concept is that of higher order conditioning. So what we do here is, again, so you first train the agent based on some stimulus B to predict the US or the reward, and then you remove the reward and now add this other stimulus which ends before the previous one. So the hope is now that this stimulus starts predicting this one, which in turn predicts the reward, and so now you have formed a second order association of A to the reward. And this is what happens. So here B, at trial number 0, B has already been trained, so it starts with a 1, and so over time it will go to 0 because it is no longer followed by a reward, right? But the association, predictive association of A will start increasing for a while to match B because A now reliably predicts B, which was predicting the reward, but eventually they all go to 0, right? So what is the TD model now? So the TD model is one way to explain all of these concepts that we just discussed in a computational or mathematical fashion. So let's say that the value of the state that you see parameterized by some weight vector W is just a weighted average of the inputs that you see, right? So one way to visualize this is, if these are the input features that you see, you multiply them by the individual weights corresponding to those features and sum them up, and that's your output. That's the value of that particular state. So a state is represented by some features which are binary, so they are either 1 or 0, and then they are combined linearly according to some weights W's. Now the TD error, as defined earlier, is just the reward obtained at the next step plus the value of that state that you end up in and subtracted by the value, your guess at this point of time, which is the value of this state. And now we'll update the weights corresponding to the value function according to this rule, which is just the old weights plus, again, towards the TD error times which feature was active. So there's a weight per feature, right? So whichever ones were active will get some updates based on the TD error. And before we go into how the TD model explains these phenomena, we'll take a look at one animation which shows us the TD model in action for the simple classical conditioning experiment. Alright, so the TD error is the reward plus the value of the next state minus the value of the current state. So this forms the new estimate, and this is the old estimate, and you're updating this towards that, right? So that's how the value function is updated. Now given here are, on the horizontal axis is time, and this is the reward, value function, and TD error, how it evolves with time. This is where we'll keep seeing a reward. And alright, so that's how the time is progressing, that orange box. And so once you see the first reward, you can compute the TD error based on that. So that will be this reward term plus, since the value function is initialized to 0, these other two terms are 0. So you see a TD error. Note that it is offset by 1 because it is at time t when you see a reward at time t plus 1. Right, now based on this TD error, we'll now update the value function. Cool. Now what happens in the next trial? Again, when we come to this time step, we now see a TD error here because that's at this time you see the reward is 0, but the value of the next state is non-zero. And again, the value of this particular state is 0, so again this term is non-zero, hence you end up making an update here like that. And then you see the reward, but there's no TD error then, so no updates. And then this goes on and on and on. As you might expect, this will happen till the TD error it shifts all the way to the left till when you saw the Q for the first time, which in this case is the leftmost point. And yeah, finally their TD error is all the way towards the left. Alright, now that we've done that, let's now see how the TD model explains blocking. Okay, recall that the TD error is this particular quantity. And now we'll replicate the blocking experiment from before, which is there is some US or the reward which is presented at some time denoted by these indices, and then for some time before that there is this CS, the conditional stimulus B, right? And so when only the CSB is trained, what is the association learned for that? So we can compute what the TD error is. So the TD error at time step 4 is the reward at time step 5, which is we'll take as 1, plus the value of the state at time step 5 minus value of state at time step 4. Now at time step 5, you already received the reward, so the value of this state is 0, and the value of this state is, as defined earlier, a linear combination of the features corresponding to that state. So this is just one feature, which is B. So B is present, so 1, and the weight associated with it. And this was the reward that we see. And when the training has ended, the TD error has gone down to 0, right? Because now the learning is complete. So 0 equals to this, which means that weight is 1. So this is what you would expect to see, and this is what you observe. Right, and now we introduce the second stimulus at the same time, so which is A. So after adding CSA, what does the TD error now look like? So the TD error would again be the reward at the next step, which is 1, plus the value of that state is 0. But now the value of the previous state, which is at time step 4, is this sum of two things: the weight associated with A and the weight associated with B, both multiplied by 1s because both of those features are on, which means WA and WB add up to be 1. If initially But we know that WB was 1, right? This is where, this is the time at which will be introduced, right? So if WB is 1 and this is true, that means WA will be 0. And that is what we see, right? That's so CSA is introduced here and WB is already learned and is 1. It will stay that way, and there's no learning that can happen with A because the predictions are being made reliably with the existing value function. Okay, similarly, the TD model explains higher order conditioning. How? Again, we start with just the CSB and the US. The time is marked here, and we did this last time. The associative strength of this the stimulus B turns out to be 1. Now we remove the US, which is the reward, and now add this secondary stimulus A, which starts earlier than B and ends right before B starts. Now let's look at what the TD error is at this point of time. It's the reward at the next step, which is 0, plus value of the state here minus the value of the state here. So at this state only this feature is on, that of B, and at time step 2 only A is on, this, which means WA is equal to WB. Training is complete, so this is 0. But at time step 4, what's going on? Now that you don't have any reward here anymore, the association of B goes down to 0. And that's what we see. So over time, association of B goes down to 0, and A tries to match B as much as possible, starting off from 0, and yeah, eventually they're both 0. Okay, so now we come to the cool part, which is the TD model explained some observed phenomena, which was blocking and higher order conditioning. But now it is predicting a new phenomena, which is termed as the reversal of blocking. So what is the reversal of blocking? Again, we start off with some reward and a stimulus to predict that reward. And yeah, again, we did this earlier, and we know that the associative strength would be 1. Now, in blocking, we introduce the second stimulus exactly at the same time as the previous one, and then we end up learning nothing. But what if the stimulus is introduced before the learned one, and then what happens? Again, at this time step, the reward at the next time step is 1, value of that state is 0, and the value at this state at this time step is the sum of these two things, because both of these are active, right? So WBA plus WB is 1. Okay, this happened last time too, no big surprises here. Now what's happening at time step 2? So the TD error there is you get no reward, so 0. The value of the state here comprises of B and A, and this one just comprises of A. So these two things get cancelled, which means VB becomes 0. The weight associative strength of B becomes 0. So here WB has become 0, and this is 2, which means WA has now become 1. So in plain English, this means that you have learned an association with A which was blocked initially by introducing A before B. And so this is what would happen. So we are plotting the associative strength of B. If A was not introduced and B was already trained, it would remain that way. But if B was trained and then A was introduced, over time the associative strength of B would go down to 0, and that of A would increase. So the TD model predicts that this would happen, and this is what was confirmed by a group of researchers later. And so yeah, this is quite remarkable because the TD model is just a computational model that was built to explain some observed phenomena, but it ended up predicting some phenomena which was then later confirmed to occur in animals. Yeah, so that's kind of the takeaway from this part. Now we will move on to the next part, which is some neuroscience background. Right, so this is, well, you might be familiar with the structure of a neuron. This is a nucleus, these are some dendrites, cell body, the axon and axon terminals. These axon terminals are connected to the dendrites of the next neuron, which is on the way. So this one is called presynaptic. So any action potential or activation that happens in this neuron travels down this axon and dissociates through the various axon terminals to the connected uh, neurons. And this happens through this connection called a synapse, which is, so you can see they don't really touch here, but what happens that there's a gap here. So the presynaptic neuron, which is this one, so this is the axon terminal of this one. So when the action potential reaches here, it releases these particles called neurotransmitters, which then travel across this cell fluid and get attached to these receptors in the receiving neuron. And based on how many of such receptors got how many neurotransmitters, the downstream cell might get activated and send the action potential down, and so on and so forth. Right, and so dopamine is one such neurotransmitter. Okay, so a group of researchers formed this reward prediction error hypothesis, which says that one of the functions of the phasic activity of dopamine producing neurons in mammals is to deliver an error between an old and a new estimate of the expected future reward to target areas throughout the brain. So, does this sound a little familiar? The error between an old and new estimate of expected future reward. That's what the TD error is about, right? So, this hypothesis is kind of saying that the function of dopamine is similar to that of the TD error. And that's what the researchers set out to test. And so what you see here is every row is the activation of a dopamine neuron in a rat, and this thing on top is the histogram. So which means that if there are many neurons activated at a particular time, you'll see a taller bar versus a shorter bar if nothing was activated at that time. So this curve is showing you that initially when you have no stimulus, there is some baseline neural activity in the dopamine neurons, but as soon as you see some reward, there is a spike in the activity. Now, after learning has happened and the reward is now reliably predicted, what happens is as soon as the stimulus is seen, so this could be like the bell, then the dopamine neurons fire, and they don't fire when the reward actually happens, which is, let's say, the food. But let's say the reward was predicted when you saw the CS, but the reward did not actually happen. So then you see a decrease in the dopamine firing activity. Uh, yeah, so now this might be sounding familiar, right? Because remember the first example we saw, the animation about how the TDE model works for the simple classical conditioning experiment. So this is, yeah, the pictorial representation of that again. So again, on horizontal is the time axis. So you see the reward, which you see at some later time step. The initial value function is 0, and when you haven't learned anything, your first TD error is when you see that reward. So which is kind of like the spikes here. Then when learning is complete, you learned a value function here. So you only see a TD error when you first see the stimulus, which is here. And that's similar to what we saw again in the dopamine firing activity. And if the learning is complete but the reward is omitted, so when the cue happens, you see a positive TD error, but when actually the reward was supposed to happen but it didn't happen, there is a dip or a negative TD error, which corresponds exactly to the dip in the dopamine activity here. So you see there is this striking parallel between how the TD error drives learning in the TD model and how the dopamine neurons behave during the process of learning in rats, which is pretty cool. So this shows you that there is some correlation between what the dopamine neurons are doing and what the TD error achieves. But yeah, you might be saying, as you might rightly point out, that this is just a correlation, right? And this does not give us any causal evidence. So yeah, some researchers try to answer the causal part of it. So they tested this by optogenetics, which is the process of genetically modifying dopamine neurons so that they can be activated or inhibited by pulses of laser light. So you see the rat here. Uh, there is this optic fiber going through its brain uh, to the bunch of dopamine neurons, and so whenever this light is pulsed, the dopamine neurons can basically be controlled to be activated or inhibited. And so they use this to perform again a bunch of experiments, one of which I'm showing you here now, which is the blocking experiment that we saw earlier. So just to recap, this is the brain, this is the part where the dopamine neurons for the rat are, and here you see the bunch of optic fibers landing up. Right, so what is the task? Based on some auditory cue, you get some sucrose juice, which is very rewarding for these rats. So this is the US for the stimulus A. Now, if you pair this auditory stimulus with a light, which means you're adding another stimulus at the same time as the stimulus which is already learned, you have some number of trials like this, and then you see if the rat reacts when it sees just the light. So in general, this will be blocked, as we learned earlier. But what these researchers did is that they made the dopamine neurons fire when these two were presented together after this was learned. So when originally there would not be any TD error when these two are shown together, with the artificial dose of dopamine, it turned out that the rat learns to associate the light stimulus with the sucrose juice pellet as well. So yeah, so this is one of the many experiments they performed to convincingly establish that dopamine indeed drives learning. And yeah, that is pretty big because now we learned that there was a correlation between what the dopamine does, achieves in terms of learning, and what the TD error does in the TD model of learning. And if so, the causal relation now tells us that dopamine indeed drives learning, which is pretty cool. Um, but where do we go from here now? So now that we know that there are all these cool connections between RL, psychology, neuroscience, some computational models formed to explain some phenomena that was observed, ended up predicting some new phenomena that was found to be observed in animals. And then there was a causal relationship that was established between what the dopamine neurons achieve and what the TDI error does. So, yeah. So while there have been many advances in RL that you might have heard of in terms of, making a superhuman uh, game playing agent of like Go, chess, all these games like that, and then achieving some kind of very efficient data center cooling as opposed to hand coded heuristic methods. RL has had a lot of success stories, but there are many tasks in the brain which the brain there are many tasks which the brain seems to handle quite naturally that are very challenging for current models of RL. And so there might be certain insights from psychology or neuroscience that can help in these cases. So, for example, um, one of the major questions is in RL, we assume that we have a good representation of the world, which means we have access to good state features. Like in the example that we saw, we had those binary features for when they were on and off, right? But how are these features even formed? Like, how are these features constructed? How does the brain construct a representation from just the perception that it has of from through the sensory stimulus that the body has before it performs any action? So perception, representation, action, that is kind of how we think it is, but is there even such a separation in the brain? Does the brain have this kind of a pipeline in which it does these things sequentially in a modular fashion? That would be uh, great to know because that can help us think about how we should design computational models of the same. And something which is related, which is how does the brain encode, retrieve, and combine knowledge of different kinds learned at different times? Because you know humans are pretty flexible in terms of the kind of variety of tasks that they can achieve. So let's say you're put in front of a video game console now, in no time you'll be able to learn how to play that game and start beating your friends, for example. But RL agents at this point of time have to learn from scratch for every new task that they're given, which is very time taking. And yeah, that's not the kind of general purpose intelligent systems that we are looking to build. So how does the human or animal brain do this? Like how does it leverage its memory to uh, put together all these different pieces of knowledge and combine them in ways that are helpful for any new task that we encounter? And another kind of related point is that how are high level actions performed by combining low level muscle twitches. So, an example could be that let's say you want to catch a ball, right? So, somebody throws a ball, and then you have to run some distance, stick out your hands in just the right position and time to be able to catch that. But to achieve this kind of high level actions of like running and catching, uh, all of this has to be done at the uh, muscle and skeleton level, right? Which means through individual muscle twitches at every joint. So, how does this happen? Is there some sort of hierarchical or modular arrangement of these actions, like from all the way to these from the low level twitches, building up to some sort of skills that can be put together in some modular fashion to perform new kinds of high level actions, right? Yeah, so how is this done? Like, we don't have any idea, and knowing how this is achieved in humans or other animals would be very useful. um, there are people who say that why should we even look at inspiration from humans or other animals? Don't we want to create something that is smarter than humans, for instance? um, well, while that's true, we can still be inspired by the human brain because it's one of the most intelligent systems that we know of. And all the other generic approaches that we have tried haven't really succeeded as of yet in creating any sort of intelligent systems with like generic abilities. So, yeah, the hope is that all of us from all these different fields can put our minds together to figure out how the mind works. That would be awesome. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you so much for taking out the time to listen slash watch this.